The power went out just after sunset, without warning and without apology. One moment the apartment was filled with the usual noise of the evening, a TV murmuring in the background, the hum of the fridge, lights glowing softly, and the next it was silent and dark. She stood still in the kitchen, waiting for everything to come back on. It didn't. Outside, the city sounded confused, cars slowing down, voices carrying farther than usual. He checked his phone, saw there was no signal, and laughed quietly at how quickly the world seemed to shrink when electricity disappeared. They lit a few candles they had almost forgotten about, placing them carefully around the room. Shadows moved along the walls, making the space feel unfamiliar and strangely intimate. With nothing to distract them, they sat on the floor, backs against the couch, sharing the last of the snacks meant for another day. Conversation came easily at first, jokes about how unprepared they were, memories of childhood blackouts, guesses about how long it would last. Time stretched, unmeasured, no notifications or clocks demanding attention. As the night deepened, the talk shifted naturally. They spoke about things they usually postponed, worries they avoided naming, dreams they weren't sure they were allowed to want. Without screens between them, listening felt different, fuller. He admitted that silence used to scare him because it forced him to face his own thoughts. She confessed that she filled her days with noise so she wouldn't have to sit still with uncertainty. Saying these things out loud didn't make the darkness heavier. It made it warmer. At some point, they opened the window. The city outside was dotted with candlelight and phone flashlights, strangers temporarily connected by the same inconvenience. Someone laughed from a nearby balcony, another voice answered, and for a moment the whole neighborhood felt closer, slower, human. They sat there together, wrapped in a blanket, realizing how rare it was to be fully present without planning to be. When the lights finally flickered back on hours later, neither of them rushed to stand up. The moment felt fragile, like it might disappear if they moved too quickly. Eventually, they blew out the candles one by one, leaving the last flame for a second longer than necessary. The power returned, but something else stayed. They understood that sometimes it takes darkness to remind you what matters, not what you watch, not what you scroll through, but who you sit beside when everything else goes quiet. The next morning felt different, even though everything looked the same. Sunlight filled the apartment, the electricity worked perfectly, and the familiar sounds of the city returned as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet both of them moved a little slower, more deliberately, as if they were still adjusting to the quiet they had shared the night before. Coffee brewed, phones buzzed with missed notifications, and reality tried to pull them back in. Neither rushed to check messages. That could wait. Something about the darkness had reminded them how often they let the world interrupt moments that mattered. They talked about the night again, not dramatically, but thoughtfully. About how rare it was to sit without distraction and still feel connected. About how easy it had been to open up once there was nothing else competing for attention. He admitted that he couldn't remember the last time he felt so present, so unguarded. She said the blackout had shown her that silence wasn't empty, it was space. Space to listen, to feel, to notice what usually slipped by unnoticed. Saying it out loud made it real, something they could carry forward instead of leaving behind as a strange, one-time experience. Over the following days, they caught themselves changing small habits. Phones stayed face down during conversations. Music played softer. Evenings became less rushed. They didn't force these changes or turn them into rules, they just felt right. When stress crept in, when noise returned in the form of deadlines and expectations, one of them would mention the candles, the shadows on the wall, the city glowing quietly outside. It became a shared reference point, a reminder that they didn't need much to feel close. Weeks later, another storm passed through the city, but this time the lights stayed on. Still, they lit a candle anyway, sat together, and smiled at the memory. The power outage hadn't changed their lives in any dramatic way. It hadn't fixed everything or solved their problems. But it had given them something subtle and lasting, an understanding that connection doesn't always come from doing more, but from removing what isn't necessary. And in a world that rarely slows down on its own, that lesson stayed with them, glowing quietly, long after the lights came back on.